the critical social justice method really is kind of a codified way to teach people to indulge in self-pity and to refuse to take even some personal responsibility. So shifting out of that, the system, I blame the system mindset into one of, well, maybe the system does suck, but what have I done? And accepting some of that responsibility changes everything in terms of your ability to succeed, your ability to grow, your ability to be happy, your ability to produce something in the world that keeps the world running. That shift in mindset from, well, let's just blame everything so it's not my fault and I can have that moment of psychological safety, if you want to call it that, that's destructive.
And to quote, expose the political corruption that's taken hold of the university, James Lindsay and 2 others made headlines in 2018 with a series of hoax articles published in peer-reviewed journals. Since, Lindsay has made it his life's mission to understand the ideas and theories underpinning what they dubbed grievance studies. Just how are these identity-oriented academic fields rooted in deeply flawed methodologies? And how has neo-Marxism, and what Lindsay recently named critical social justice, permeated the education system in America? In this episode, we sit down with Lindsay, who documents his work on his website, New Discourses, where a constantly updated social justice encyclopedia can also be found. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jekielek. James Lindsay, so great to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Glad to be here.
You became famous / infamous, I guess, depending who you ask, doing a series of articles. I think you and Helen Pluckrose and Peter Boghossian, you wrote a series of hoax articles, I think 20 of them, submitted them to a number of peer-reviewed journals, and some of them got accepted, and they're outrageous.
Right.
I mean, I think this might resonate. People will remember this whole thing. Tell me a little bit about what happened, what you did.
Yeah, sometimes I like to tell people I got famous for getting the words canine sex on the front page of the New York Times. Because one of our papers was about observing dog sex at dog parks and then trying to divine people's attitudes about rape culture and homosexuality and these other kind of, identity things that are kind of cropping up everywhere in woke culture by watching things happen, like dogs having sex with each other. So kind of an implicit bias test, as they call it.
And but outrageous.
Outrageous.
Like
oh
this
yeah,
just
the papers made no sense. They were full of logic that doesn't work and horrendous recommendations. For that paper, for example, recommended that we might solve our problems of rape culture by training men the way we train dogs, leashing them, metaphorically shocking them as like a shock collar. And we had other papers that recommended that privileged white male students would benefit in their educational experiences by sitting in the floor and not having their questions or emails answered by the professors and wearing chains to experience reparations, as we phrased it. And these papers were treated very, very favorably by high-level academic journals in feminism and gender studies and ethnic studies and the likes. And we ended up getting 7 of them accepted for publication in a matter of a few months, about 10 months total writing and getting them accepted. We had 7 more out of the 20 that we wrote that still had a pretty good shot. We could have edited them and sent them back in. And so we had a resounding level of success at getting absolute horrifying nonsense published within, again, these feminist, gender studies, ethnic studies, cultural studies, identity studies type journals at the highest level of academic excellence, I suppose is a word we could apply.
So you dubbed these disciplines grievance studies,
right.
I think. Alongside this whole effort, you named it.
Right.
Yeah.
So we were looking for, it's very awkward to say feminism, gender studies, ethnic studies, identity studies, critical race theory. The list goes on and on and on and on. Sexuality studies, queer studies. It's just, there's so many of these things. And they're kind of the same and kind of not the same. So it becomes very difficult to kind of, name the enemy, if you will. And so we came up with the term grievance studies. It turns out we didn't know that we hadn't invented that term. A literary theorist, I think, or something, Stefan Collini, actually used the same term for the same idea, unbeknownst to us, in one essay that he had written about a decade or two earlier. But the idea was that these are kind of cultural studies or identity studies type fields, and all they tend to focus on is grievance. So we said, well, they're studying grievance. They're studying reasons to be disgruntled or to complain. And so we summarized with the term grievance studies, which has stuck. I even saw that grievance studies has become a mod in a video game recently. Some video game, Civilizations, has a grievance studies technology that it gets in. It does something like reduces your civilization's output by 50%. I mean, just all these terrible things when it gets invented.
Fascinating.
So it's really stuck.
But so you mentioned naming the enemy. Ostensibly these disciplines are not, they're not trying to do something bad, or are they? Like, they're trying to help people, right? Ostensibly.
They think they are, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's the issue?
To say that they lack a methodology it's rigorous would be to start talking about the problem. The way that they approach answering questions about the world is not rigorous. It's not scientific. In fact, is openly hostile to science most of the time. And so that's bad. But it's, as I was saying, since they reject and they're hostile to science, it's not even that they lack a methodology, it's that they have a approach that's exactly backwards for how we should answer questions that are important. And so if you think, and if you think like I do, that questions about race and racism, or sex and sexism, or homosexuality and homophobia, transphobia, all of these kinds of issues, if you think those are important, it seems to me very clear that getting good information about those and then trying to, say, shape policy or do advocacy or lobbying or whatever it is that you want to do with that information, it seems like you have to get the good information first with rigorous methods, science, good polling, good surveys. Like, let's actually go out with police violence and see what do the numbers actually look like, and then we'll operate based on what the real numbers are and what the real numbers are telling us. But instead, you see none of that here. You see hostility to that. In fact, I recently heard about a study that showed, speaking of police violence, that there was a very careful study that was done by a group of researchers in Texas, and there was no evidence of racial bias in, I think it was only lethal use of force, but something police use of force. And the response was that activists descended upon the researchers and said, well, this paper shouldn't be published, it should be unpublished, you should lose your degrees, all of your papers should be unpublished, you shouldn't be allowed to continue working because you've published something that says the opposite of what we believe, and we think that that's a big problem. So for me, again, it gets it exactly backwards. If you want to do activism or advocacy, and I hope if you're interested in these problems, I hope you do, you have to start by getting the questions right and the answers to those questions right. You don't start with the answer you want and then do it backwards and make sure that that your activism leads your scholarship versus your studies telling you how to become an activist properly.
So this comes to this idea of narratives, right, guiding. Well, narratives seem to be guiding a lot of what's going on in our society right now. But you're basically saying that in these fields of study and beyond, we're going to talk about this today, these narratives come first.
Right. And in fact, that's how we wrote our fake papers. That's why we were successful writing these, crazy and horrible academic papers and getting them in. Is we knew what conclusions would be publishable, so we started with the conclusion and then just made it up to get there. And we, stole ideas from their literature and twisted things around. And like I said earlier, most of the time things didn't actually follow one to the next. For example, with the dog sex paper, we said that we have to analyze it through black feminist criminology, just because. It didn't matter just because. And there were a lot of putting in a method that was just because. And again, we started with the conclusion, we wanted to get our way there, and just kind of massaged the scholarship out there to get there. And that's getting it backwards. You can get to any conclusion you want that way. So you're not going to get reliable or rigorous information. So this is really concerning.
This is undermining scholarship. I mean, in the
Yes.
most fundamental way. I mean, that's what you're
Right.
telling me here, right?
Yes. So not only does it undermine scholarship into those subjects, race, sex, sexuality, gender, and so on, it undermines scholarship overall, because when people recognize, as they will, and believe me, they've noticed, that this stuff looks like BS, most people aren't taking the time to say, oh, well, it's just these particular disciplines within the humanities that are acting. No, they're either all scholarship or all science, or especially all social science, which isn't correct, is just false. And so it's destroying. You brought up the idea of narratives. It's turning the idea of knowledge into just a narrative.
Actually sounds horrific.
It's really bad. That's the kind of state where, I read before about different regimes, and they say that the way that a lot of times a regime will take over, a totalitarian regime, isn't by just propagandizing the people and getting them to all believe, oh, well, the party or whatever is good. It's by making it impossible for the average person to know what's true and what's not true. And then you can that's when you can impose a narrative on people.
Right.
When they have their own means by which they can, check information one against another and work their way toward something they can agree upon as being true, it's not as easy to impose a narrative. But when everybody's confused and nobody knows what's true and nobody knows how to tell what information is good and what information is bad, that's where propaganda can take over.
This is, part of what I'm interested. This sounds exactly like communist China. What the scenario you're describing.
Right.
People know, they don't know what is true necessarily. They know maybe part of it is, maybe isn't. Media
Right.
are fully controlled, and with it's deliberate. It's very very interesting and disturbing, frankly.
Right.
But you just reminded me, actually. I think recently you've been looking into how this ideological approach to scholarship, I guess, is even getting into K-12 education. Like, I think you had a podcast. Can you tell me? I haven't had a chance to explore that.
It's not getting into. It is deeply into K through 12 education. Actually, P through 20. That's a term I'm relatively new to. It includes pre-K, and I'm assuming, if I'm guessing what 20 means, all the way through university and graduate school. I'm not sure how the numbers work beyond 12, to be honest, but 20 would imply PhD.
Right.
Counting the years on my fingers, And so the colleges of education have been absolutely taken over by what's called critical pedagogy. That means applying the idea of critical theory to education. And we don't have to be really deep into what critical theory means, but it's all of these things where, starting with the conclusion and working backwards, we've been speaking about, fall under the umbrella of critical methods, critical theory. And so the colleges of education, literally since the 1980s, have been heavily under the sway of this. You have this very famous book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, written by a Brazilian post-communist, technically, named Paulo Freire. And that book is something just like almost legendary canon in education. You had guys in the 70s like Michael Apple leading into another guy, much more influential, Henry Giroux, who through the late 70s and most of the 80s essentially kind of ran a one-man operation that remade our entire, not education system, but our colleges of education. So where we educate our educators. And so for at least a few decades now, every teacher that's gone through every teacher training, pre-service teacher education program in, as far as I know, North America, has had to read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and has had to read the way that Henry Giroux worked in neo-Marxist and postmodern philosophy into those concepts to make education become less about informing or teaching the student to think and more about awakening what the neo-Marxists called a critical consciousness. That was in fact Freire's big contribution, was that education should be about awakening a critical consciousness where you're teaching students to see how they are oppressed. That's the most important thing, is to teach them how society is oppressing them, teach them to be able to see how they're being oppressed, and to obviously want to take up activism against that.
You call this critical social justice, this system. You've named it recently, actually.
Right.
We talked about this a little bit offline. What are the components here of this? You've started sketching this out.
Yeah, I mean, it gets deep quick, but there are kind of three big components that are relevant here, which would be social justice and critical are obviously both in the name, and the third isn't in the name, which is postmodernism, and that actually, from my opinion, falls under social justice. So social justice in a kind of a broad picture is this idea that we should try to make society more fair, and in particular we should take steps to make society more fair and equal outside of the kind of narrow limits of what the law can achieve. The law can only do so much. We don't want oppressive laws telling us how to think or how to act or how to speak. And so there becomes this gray area outside of what the law could or should dictate, but we still, can create a very unfair situation for people. With total freedom of speech, you can be totally racist, for example. You can make discrimination laws that prevent discrimination in the workplace, but you can't stop people from having, bad attitudes toward different people. So there's this idea that you have to extend it, and that can be done in any variety of methods. It arose first in the religious context, as a matter of fact. A Jesuit priest came up with the idea of social justice a couple of centuries ago, in the 1700s at some point. And then it had a huge renaissance around the turn of the 19th to 20th century in the Baptist tradition. So it was a very religious concept originally. It can be done in a liberal, meaning philosophically liberal, not the American politics words approach. You'd see that with the philosophers like John Rawls. He had a very his so-called veil of ignorance, and the idea that the veil of ignorance idea is that if you wanted to design a fair society, you would you want to come up with the rules as though after you've built the system, you have to enter it, but you don't know who you get to be. Right? So that's the veil of ignorance. So maybe you want to design a society where people like you have advantages, but you don't know who people like you are going to be ahead of time. So you'll come up with a very fair society. So he had these interesting ideas. Then there are ways to do it that are not liberal, or in fact anti-liberal. And the critical method has taken this up and basically hijacked social justice totally. Critical refers to critical theory. Critical theory was born in the Frankfurt School, so-called Institute for Social Research, in the 1920s and 30s by communists who realized that Marxist revolutions weren't going to occur spontaneously. Georg Lukács in particular tried to foist a communist revolution on Hungary, and it failed. And then off he goes to Germany, and with a couple of his collaborators creates this institute. And their goal was to try to understand a few things. Why are people resistant to the communist revolution? Why doesn't it happen? Why do people vote for politicians who are against their interests? In particular, why do they vote for fascists? Why do they fall for propaganda? So it's hard to condemn that project, just wholesale from its origins. It was very philosophical and intellectual. But what they decided was that liberal society, and again, philosophically liberal societies, actually brainwash people into not realizing that they are oppressed. And so you had this concept of hegemony that comes in. That's where ideology, rather than powerful interests, control how people think. They were very concerned that there was a popular culture emerging, and instead of the unwashed masses aspiring to high culture and high art and high literature, no, they wanted to watch football or whatever it happens to be. And they were very concerned about that. So they thought that this created all kinds of ways by which the powerful class could assert itself upon everybody and create control without, necessarily pulling political levers.
And without people fully understanding that that's what was happening.
Correct. Right. Yeah. False consciousness.
Yeah.
Absolutely. They believe that, people think that they're acting in their own interests, but their interests are actually being controlled by how the elite in society set society up. What's good, what's bad, what's cool, what's uncool, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, what are the right ways to talk about things, discourses, what are the wrong ways to talk about things. And so the critical method was born to pick at that. It is to try to help people understand how the system is oppressing them and that the system itself is the problem. Rather than seeing liberalism as a philosophy built upon self-reflection and incremental progress, they saw it as just another conspiracy by the powerful to keep people down and to prevent them from wanting to become communists.
So this is neo-Marxism.
This
basically.
is neo-Marxism.
Right.
That is the birth of neo-Marxism.
Okay.
Correct. Which is not Marxism. The Marxists have never been particularly fond of the neo-Marxists, and so it starts getting really hairy then. And then the postmodern philosophers are the third part in critical social justice, because the way social justice has been taken up, I said there are illiberal ways to do it. Critical is one. Well, postmodern is another. Postmodernists basically were these mostly, it's art, it's architecture, there's lots of veins of postmodernism, but within social philosophy, it was this kind of movement in French philosophy at the Sorbonne in Paris. Names associated would be like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jean-Francois Lyotard. And these guys, they were also disillusioned Marxists. They were big fans of Mao, as a matter of fact, but just disillusioned. So you had a group of people who were so pessimistic and cynical because, well, liberalism's bad, capitalism's bad, all of the systems of the West are bad, and communism's bad too. So now they have nothing. So what's their whole answer to everything? Well, nothing is good. It's just complete nihilism. And so they came up with this concept of deconstructing society and trying to just take everything apart and show everything is absurd and meaningless. And all of those things actually got pressed together into a crucible in the 90s. And they've become what people recognize as the social justice movement, but they don't realize that it's critical theory. They don't recognize how deeply postmodern it is. And so my job now is to try to help people understand those things.
And so the piece that isn't in there, which obviously is a big part of it, is the identity politics.
Right.
So
that's the neo-Marxism, actually.
Okay. So just briefly explain.
So the Frankfurt School had a number of different people. It had different eras. It was actually really intellectual, even though it was, I wouldn't call it good, but it was very intellectually oriented in its beginnings, in the 20s and the 30s. And then World War II happened, and it shifted rather dramatically. And became much more activist. And then as time crept into the late 50s into the 60s, its activist dimension, still from a very kind of intellectualist elite mindset, but its activist dimension really took off. And that really follows the thinking of one particular philosopher in the late Frankfurt School, which was Herbert Marcuse. It's a pretty well-recognized name. Marcuse is famous for having started the so-called New Left. The New Left was the activist movement. Mostly it came from his, I forget what the entire book is called, but he has a chapter in a book critiquing tolerance. The chapter is called Repressive Tolerance. And he basically in that chapter makes the case that if it's for progress, it shouldn't be censored. Even if it's violence, it should be allowed because it's on the side of, right, of what's righteous. But the political right, more or less, because it supports the status quo, should be censored. In fact, he says it should not just be censored, it should be pre-censored, which I assume has to do with even stamping out the thought rather than just the speech. And so you get this idea from him that tolerance means destroying anything that's intolerant, as they defined it. And so this New Left actually are all of your big identity politics movements that erupted in contrast to the civil rights movements of the 1960s. You have what's called the Antifa, anti-fascist movement that was mostly in Europe. It was big. That was the New Left in Europe. We had black liberationism in the United States. So that's your Malcolm X instead of Martin Luther King. You had some of the radical feminist stuff took a lot of inspiration from it, but they were kind of doing their own thing. And you had liberation theology in South America particularly, which is a Catholic thing, and that's probably where Paulo Freire got his ideas to make education be about critical theory. So the identity politics, in the sense that we mean identity politics, because that means a few things. This very vigorous, very exclusionary approach to talking about identity and believing that identities have their own knowledges and their own, there's power in reifying identity and making identity real and important. I am black means more than I'm a person who happens to be black. That kind of identity politics really comes out of this neo-Marxist view. Sometimes the word, I don't like to get into this word, but sometimes the word for neo-Marxism, they called themselves cultural Marxists. It means 3 or 4 things. One of them is a conspiracy theory, and so it's not easy to talk about cultural Marxism, but it's the idea of the, so Marx drew on a philosopher Hegel to describe the master and slave dialectic, that if you are oppressed, you understand oppression and you understand the system that oppresses you, but if you are the oppressor, you only understand the position of oppression, of dominance, social dominance. So you have extra understanding. Marx drew heavily on that with his proletariat versus bourgeoisie, or the capitalist class in particular. And then obviously these neo-Marxist guys said, well, Marx must have been wrong about something. And what they actually did was tried to tie in Freudian psychoanalysis to it, to diagnose how false consciousness works in people for real, and they decided that it's actually cultural. There's say it's a race or an ethnicity or a gender or whatever that has this oppressed status, and they have their own culture as an oppressed group within society, and that became the site for those identity politics, was that exact same what Marx called dialectic, now applied not to economic class, but rather to social group status, which they believe is stratified in a similar way.
And this group status is the defining unit, basically, of society.
Yes.
So.
Liberal societies, it's very interesting because they're kind of like 3 levels, right, that we can think of human interaction or human beings. We're individuals as an atomic unit. We're all human, so human universalism. We all have that in common, universal humanity. And then there's our groups that we belong to. Those could be social groups, those could be identity groups, or whatever they happen to be. And so liberalism, if you go all the way into kind of hardcore classical, really hardcore classical liberalism, I don't know that it even cares that much about universal humanity. We're all individuals, the end, right? But liberalism as a broader philosophy, especially what they call traditional liberalism, kind of tries to take the big one and the small one. Individualism, we're each our own person, we each have our own thoughts, we each have our own conscience,
right.
And then also say, but no, humanity matters too. And it tried to marry those things and to appeal to that. So you see in the civil rights movements of the 60s, we're going to judge by the content of character rather than the color of skin. And you have this very big appeal to, we're all human. If you cut me, I bleed red too, the whole thing. So that's an appeal to universal humanity. Even the kind of older stuff like Sojourner Truth, ain't I a woman, right? It's appealing to something more universal. And then you have this group identity thing. And within this identity politics that's now become very dominant, that group identity is defined in terms of like race, sex, gender, all of these categories, which are basically the worst possible groups we could choose for that, right? I could understand like, oh, well, I'm a conservative, or I'm a progressive, or those groups make sense because they share common thought. But there's no reason to believe that just because people happen to have the same skin color, that they have the same thoughts.
The exact same thoughts.
Very close to exactly the same thoughts, yeah. Because it's theorized that they have an authentic experience of well, I should say that they have a particular experience of oppression based on that identity mark, and then they can speak to that authentically or inauthentically. And so if they're speaking to it authentically, it's always going to sound the same, because clearly, sarcastically here, clearly the all black people experience exactly the same thing, exactly the same racism or whatever it is. So that's the mentality, is they are trying to focus entirely not on the individual's irrelevant, not on universal humanity, such a thing doesn't exist. Your group identity, that thing in the middle, and then groups defined as badly as you can define them, is all that matters.
And if you think differently, this is, I think I've heard, Isaiah Washington's one fellow that I've very, very interesting. I've been talking to you about this. You're dubbed a kind of race traitor and
yes.
named every horrible, most racist name
yes.
in the book.
Correct.
And that somehow makes logical sense, because you're not thinking the way that everybody clearly has to.
Right. I mean, they even when Kanye West came out in support, wore the Make America Great Again hat, and came out in support of President Trump, they said Kanye is no longer black. So it's not even about skin color. It's about what narratives you're speaking into and speaking from.
So it's all about these narratives. So, one of the things that comes out, and I've been reading your literature for a while, is that it really has nothing to do with reality. It is purely to do with how things are talked about.
Right.
Is that
That
right?
is correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's crazy. It just sounds crazy to the typical person, to me, to the typical viewer. And we're organizing our society and our education around this.
Right. It's not a good idea. So that's why you see this obsessive focus on language. That actually is the postmodern influence. The postmodernists kind of I don't want to go too deep into it, but they came out of kind of the French structural tradition, and the structure of language, it was believed, had tremendous ability to shape society. And so the way that people speak and write shapes the way that they think and believe. And so that if you can change the language, you can change the way people think, and thus you can change society. So they're obsessive about this. So that's why you have all of these, kind of humorous, almost politically correct phrasings that have come along. You have the list of all the words that you can't say now, and now it has to be, differently abled, or, whatever it happens. All these kind of, George Carlin made fun of all of these, very sanitized terms. And that's kind of, that's actually a symptom of the underlying disease. And the underlying disease is to think that language is almost like a magic spell, right? If you change the way you talk about a thing, then you change the reality. That's the view that the postmodern view has kind of evolved into, that these critical social justice people are operating from. So I recently saw a thing from the World Health Organization saying, oh, well, you shouldn't talk about people being transmitters of the coronavirus, because that puts responsibility on them for something that they probably didn't mean to do. And so you have to talk about having acquired it, or so if you, it's very much kind of on a psychological level, the belief that words are magic spells, and that if you just choose the right words and they're all sensitive enough and careful enough, then good outcomes will occur.
It just struck me as we're talking about this, James, that there's this kind of kernel of truth. There's this idea that if you believe in something strongly, you can manifest that in reality, or you can change yourself, you can change things around you. And of course, we know that's very true, that people empower themselves that way and so forth. But this is like kind of taking it and to an absurd level.
That's exactly right. It goes way beyond. So maybe I can start talking about myself in a way like, oh, I'm very presidential, or I'm very, I have high executive function, and I can kind of fake it till I make it, right? But it's another thing entirely to start saying, well, my birth certificate says that I'm male, so society has made me male, but if I don't want to be male, then I just use a different word and it'll change. And that's obviously at the heart of what's going on with much of the trans activism, which actually comes out of this queer theory that's come out of postmodern thought, and is one of the kind of pillars of critical social justice right now. And obviously it's gets a lot of attention, the trans activism does. And so the idea that changing language can literally change basically anything. The idea is actually, and there are papers, in fact books about this, is that the reason, say, that men and women are different, some of the more sophisticated thinkers on the issue, would be because men and women are socialized to be particular ways. And so maybe testosterone or estrogen or progesterone or whatever the different hormones in our bodies are, maybe those have something to do with it. But the reason those hormones came up in the levels that they did has nothing to do with biology. It has to do with having been socialized to believe that, you know, you should be more manly, so your body produces more testosterone. Because again, manly becomes a magic spell that makes boys grow into men. And they think that if you kind of change that, then you can just be whatever you want.
As we're talking again, you know, this extreme focus on use of language is creating reality. This is where this language is violence thing comes from, right?
Yeah, that has a deep pedigree in this in this academic literature, but also in the activist literature. I mentioned Marcuse, repressive tolerance. He's actually talking about how violence is justified in response to what boils down to hate speech, or something that's truly oppressive speech, because what else do you have? Of course, Marcuse wasn't a fool. He said, you know, they're going to get punished for it in the system, but they're doing so knowingly. But he still, you know, advocated that violence is an answer to oppressive speech. You have various ideas in the academic literature talking about things like epistemic violence, which occurs when I don't properly respect your status as a knower. So you claim to know something, well, it's usually something that starts with
I don't believe you.
Right.
Yeah.
So you start maybe, well, as a such and such person. And then I say, that doesn't matter. And then
You're
that
perpetuating some kind of violence on me at this point,
right,
so
because
I can punch you.
Because I've delegitimized your status as somebody who can possibly know what they're talking about. And so the belief, again, kind of tied back to that Marcusean idea, is that if I keep doing that to you, you have no recourse through speech. You have no recourse through argument to be able to make your case. You can't possibly convince me. Therefore, I've done some kind of, you know, psychological violence to you that you can then retaliate for to kind of change the way things are thought about. You have similar, I mean, these ideas get crazier and crazier, the extensions of violence. The kind of kernel of truth in it isn't even what we were just talking about. It's that if I call you a vicious name, as my wife and I call them soul strikes, you deliver a soul strike to somebody, you know, you hit them right in a weak spot in their psychology and really hurt their feelings. I mean, that actually does do psychological damage. Then it does actually have physiological consequences, like your stress levels can go up, and so and that can lead to serious physical consequences. So there's an idea that you can trace that as a form of violence and treat that as a form of violence.
Well, again, this is when there's a kernel of truth here, right? Of course, you can hurt people with your words, and sometimes, you know, quite viciously. Right. But this is like taking it to this absurd level. Right.
Again, so we can draw on queer theory because that's where most of the really absurd stuff lives. There's a concept in queer theory that was derived from kind of one of the biggest scholars that started it, named Judith Butler, that is called the violence of categorization. So if I categorize you, whether that's, I mean, for them it's going to be something to do with sex, gender, and sexuality, in a way that you don't recognize, it causes you to feel cognitive dissonance. Maybe you feel like you're a woman and I say you're a man, or I misgender you or something like that. I don't respect your gender identity. I don't respect your sexuality. If you're gay, I say maybe you're pretending, or, you know, something like this. And you feel like that doesn't match your own experience, and this creates dissonance. They call that a violence of categorization, that I put you in a category and that you don't feel like you belong in. And so that's a form of violence against you. And in fact, that's when I mentioned the birth certificate thing. Birth certificates are actually considered a perpetrator of the violence of categorization because they have male and female on them. And so again, you see where it very rapidly kind of goes away from that kernel of truth that should be recognized and should be worked with, and most people actually do recognize and are willing to understand and work with, into just absolute absurdity, just cornball stuff.
Fascinating. You know, what I'm thinking of as you're talking is this, sort of discussion that I've heard with Jordan Peterson talking about the compelled speech laws in Canada,
right,
which is where I'm from. So it's something that's important to me, and so it's one thing to be like, it's polite to call someone by the gender pronoun that they prefer, but to kind of force them to do that because of presumably this theory, right, that you're describing, is
exactly, because if you don't, then you're doing a violence against them, is in the theory. So Peter Boghossian and I have talked about this publicly a couple of times, and we we're pretty liberal people. I'm really liberal people, and so I don't care how you want to identify. If you want to identify, I don't care. Male, female, gay, straight, I don't care. I mean, people get upset when you go into something genuinely absurd, but people do this, so it's not all that absurd. If you want to identify as a dragon, I don't care. I honestly don't. Make yourself happy. Life's hard. Do what you got to do. We all got struggles. However, the moment you demand that I participate in your self-identification, not the moment that you ask me to and let me consider it and decide how I want to relate with you, the moment you demand that I participate in that, now you have left the bounds of that liberal attitude, that liberal society, that do what you want society, that works. And the compelled speech, that is a form of compelled speech, and I don't abide forms of compelled speech. So where does the limit of, say, self-identification lie? It's in that moment when you require other people to participate with it. I think most people are courteous. I think most people understand, that people have different struggles and different things. And maybe they're not even having a struggle. Maybe it's just who they are. Mm-hmm. And so somebody who is born male wants to identify as a woman and wants to use female pronouns, and you have a conversation about it. And I think most people actually, I know Jordan Peterson, as a matter of fact, even said, I go out of my way to try to use them, but I won't be forced to use them. And that difference is everything.
Mm. It's everything. That's interesting. And I think it's not necessarily obvious, because now we're talking about some sort of, especially when it becomes illegal.
Especially
thing.
When it becomes legal, like where you have, and I understand it's not holding up really well, but for the past couple of years, you could put on Twitter some comment about men and women that falls afoul of the trans lobby's sensitivity readers, or you could like or retweet those comments and have the police show up at your door. And who wants to live in that society?
What's the logical conclusion of the society that functions according to critical social justice principles? Have you done this thought experiment?
I mean, I think about it a lot. I don't think that there is a functioning society. I think that there is this kind of identity-based feudalism, when people constantly jockeying for power and more claim on victimization and oppression. And so, I mean, here's where I think about it a lot. I flew in to New York to meet with you, and you go through these airports, and you go through the flight systems are amazing, or you take the trains. It's amazing that this works. You walk around Manhattan, you look at the buildings, it's amazing that we can do this. But there's this weird entitlement that goes along with that critical social justice mindset. Like, it'll just keep working. Like, the grocery stores are still just going to have food, even if all we do is sit around and complain and fight with each other about who deserves more status, or if all we do is wallow in how we're being cheated, how it's not our fault that we can't succeed or build something, that the system's rigged against us, the system's racist, the system's sexist. So why try? And so, it's really concerning. You asked, what does a functioning society look like? It's not functioning, is what it looks like. It's not functioning. Because when something doesn't work, somebody who's deeply imbibed in critical social justice, say they mess up at their job, and they get criticized for it. Well, it's not their fault. It's that their boss was a racist. or they go to learn. I have a friend actually whose daughter was majoring in engineering, and then she stopped majoring in engineering, and the reason was, well, the department's really sexist. And then she switched her major to computer science, and she stopped majoring in computer science. Why? Well, the department's really sexist. And so there's never this, for people who've, and this person's not, some leftist loon. It's for people who've imbibed enough of this critical social justice, there's this just denial of responsibility anywhere that the system itself can be blamed instead. So you're not talking about a functioning society. You're talking about kind of like a post-Soviet society where nothing works and it's always somebody else's fault, and it's not a functioning society. It's just power struggles and getting browbeaten all the time.
The other thing that just strikes me as we're talking is, there's a wealth of studies around the idea that, if you don't accept personal responsibility, or put it a different way, accepting personal responsibility for things is deeply connected to happiness.
Yes.
And being effective. And there's a cajillion self-help books.
Yes.
That reflect this, and certainly a wide body of scientific literature. So this is almost like creating something where we deny all that, or we reject all that.
Yeah.
And so
the victim mentality isn't going to build a successful business. And by successful, I'm not talking about some weird status quo, libertarian conservative idea. I built it. It's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a business that stays in operation because it produces value that by providing people's wants or needs, right? So a food distribution business is going to succeed when it successfully distributes food. Of course, it's more complicated than that when you get into all the nitty-gritties of how business can get dirty and all of that. But nevertheless, you can't have I can't build anything because the system cheats me attitude, and then create something that actually achieves something in the world. It's all kind of, so the critical social justice mindset in a very real way is like this pessimistic, negative navel gazing. It's like, oh, woe is me. I remember seeing a very moving thing by Stephen Fry one time where he says that self-pity, not hate, self-pity is the most destructive human emotion. And so, the critical social justice method really is kind of a codified way to teach people to indulge in self-pity and to refuse to take even some personal responsibility. I'm not one of these, bootstrap everything, personal responsibility is everything, libertarian type guys. I get it, Sometimes it just doesn't work out. Sometimes you got cheated. Sometimes, things happen. But taking a defeatist attitude toward it doesn't help, and refusing to take any responsibility doesn't help. In the literature around negotiations, they talk about shifting one's mindset. If you want to have successful negotiations with people, you have to shift your mindset from blame to what they call contributions. And so the blame mindset, you can imagine kind of like a parliament getting together, and everybody says, well, the Labor Party did this, and the conservatives did that, and then you messed up this, and you ruined Obamacare, or whatever it happens to be, and blame. Somebody else did it. It's somebody else's fault. The thing didn't work out because somebody else. The contribution mindset, on the other hand, says, all right, let's take a step back and say we have a problem. And that problem exists, and it doesn't matter how that problem came into existence for the moment. Let's acknowledge we have one. Now, let's take some time to figure out how we've all contributed to making that problem. So, and it works best when people say, here's how I messed up, and they do that first, right? So shifting out of that, the system, I blame the system mindset into one of, well, maybe the system does suck, but what have I done? And accepting some of that responsibility changes everything in terms of your ability to succeed, your ability to grow, your ability to be happy, your ability to produce something in the world that keeps the world running. that shift in mindset from, well, let's just blame everything so it's not my fault and I can have that moment of psychological safety, if you want to call it that, that's destructive. And then when you switch into this mindset of, hey, let's see, maybe the system is corrupt, but what did I do wrong, or what could I do better? Then you're in a constructive mindset. It's a completely different world. And that critical social justice mindset is just to complain about how the system's not fair to certain people and to force everybody to obsess about that all the time.
Two quick thoughts, okay? One of them is that clearly the criticism, the critical social justice criticism of what everything you're saying right now is that you're a white, you're extremely privileged. You don't get the realities, and perhaps how dare you speak. I presumably me asking these questions would get the same criticism, because it doesn't matter what I say. I'm still a white guy. Right. So that puts me, as the oppressor, right?
Correct.
That's one piece. The other piece is this kind of facilitating the communication. This actually speaks to this new initiative that you have, the new Discourses, right? Which is trying to kind of open up dialogue. So I would like you to speak to both of those.
Okay, so yes, the criticism, and let me add, you said this is the criticism that they would give. One of the 20 papers that we wrote when we wrote those hoax papers we titled it "When the Joke's on You." But what we actually did was we wrote the criticism that we thought feminist philosophy would give our project. So we cited ourselves from one paper that Peter and I had done a year earlier. We referenced our own work in the paper, complained about ourselves. We created the argument saying that, we're doing a form of humor, is how we focused on it. Humor perpetrated from a position of power in order to maintain power, and that stands in direct opposition to the kind of subversive humor that tries to break down power. And so we actually wrote the argument that they would have to level against us for the work that we did. So we do understand the mindset, because that paper was very rapidly accepted by the leading feminist philosophy journal in the world with great praise, very great praise. So we understand that idea. Again, that's where you have the denial both of individual thought and the denial of universal humanity. To say that if you and I have some kind of a difference, whether it's race, whether it's sex or gender, whether it's sexuality, whatever it happens to be, that we can't understand one another, well, what can you do?
It's
right?
Game over. I mean,
it's game over. And then it just becomes a power struggle where you assert what they say, you engage your positionality and I engage my positionality, and we figure out where I have more oppression, so I have some kind of authority to speak over you, and you have some, and then if there's, nothing to be done as a result of that, then nothing's to be done. The thought process there is called internalized dominance, though. It's that people with dominant positions believe that their position of dominance is normal and natural and justified, and that it justified, say, by merit or by producing something that works, or these kinds of by being knowledgeable in a scientific system, and it carries with it this idea that we're blind to, that dominance blinds you to, say, the realities of race or racism, as though literally I can't understand it. So if I sat down to speak with somebody who's experienced racism, to say that I can't possibly understand that just becomes an impasse, right? So I have to reject that. I think that people are more empathetic than that. I think that people are more imaginative than that. I think people care more than that. I can't accept, people can assert this, I just don't think it's true.
And it fundamentally prevents you from being able to communicate in a meaningful way. Right?
In fact, it's very funny, right? Because they say, well, you have to learn about racism, and then you can't learn about racism. So you kind of get this sense that there's some weird power game going on because there's no possible way to do it right. And if there's no possible way to do it right, then all you have to do is await your criticism and be put in your place by somebody who's now assuming power over you. It's a very poisonous thing. So that's what New Discourses is about. I want to break that. That's becoming a more and more common way people are thinking, because this stuff has made it through our education system, because this stuff is so prevalent in our media now, because the critical social justice mindset has really grown. I don't want to say is growing. I'm not sure if it's growing anymore. People are starting to realize it and not like it. It's institutionalizing very successfully and very rapidly, especially in our school systems, like to a new level. But I don't think it's ascendant anymore, at least not with most people. And I want to facilitate it not being ascendant. I want us to start talking to one another again, to try to understand one another again, and not on some kooky theoretical basis that says that I have to understand you based on who you happen to be in particular ways, or I'm somehow oppressing you. That achieves nothing. Or a way that says that, let's say that we had a racial difference between us. The only authentic relationship that we could possibly have is one that engages race all the time. So we can't be friends. We have to talk about how one of us is experiencing some racial oppression all the time until the one who isn't understands it but can't understand it. And so you can see that it's like making relationships, whether that's friends, whether that's in the workplace, whether that's families, making relationships be all about digging into the most divisive things, and then from a theory that says that they are permanently divisive. So I say we've got to step away from this. So we've got to understand it and see that it's junk and pick better ways. So that's what New Discourses, that's why I made New Discourses anyway.
Well, and I go there regularly actually now to read. I think there's some really, really interesting articles. But what exactly can people find there? I know there's some great kind of ideas around the type of stuff that we're talking about right now. But what else is it? What's the purpose? And
the purpose is, for now, it's rather new. The purpose at present is to produce both articles, well, not both, articles, videos, probably audio, podcasters, I don't know, something, and other particularly educational resources that help people understand not just what critical social justice is actually saying, but how it thinks, how it came to think this way, what its history is. So I'm trying to make this set of ideas intelligible to more people. Right now it's pretty academic because I feel like this is a real difficulty. I've been trying to take this stuff on, head on for at least a couple, maybe 3 years, 4 years now. And all I ever hear is, well, your criticism doesn't count because you don't understand it. And in fact, they say that you didn't engage it properly. Because the only way to engage critical theory is with a critical consciousness. So you have to be a critical theorist first, at which point you'll agree with it, presumably. So in a sense, that if you don't come out agreeing with it, you didn't understand it, is the claim. We've heard people say things like this before at different times, and it never works out really well. No. So I want to make it very, very clear that I do understand this mindset, the scholars, the scholarship that are involved with it, so that level of defense that it gives for itself can fall away. Because what happens, and I'm trying to think, I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and what they said was that it's just absolutely amazing to watch how the social justice stuff works, because they come in, the critical social justice lobbyists or activists or whatever come in, and they start talking about their stuff. And nobody knows what they're talking about. Nobody has any idea what they're talking about, but they assume they must know what they're talking about. And so they just kind of agree. They just kind of go along with it. And that really needs to stop. People need to understand that what they're asking for isn't what it sounds like they're asking for. And in fact, they really need to understand that because of the nature of critical theory, and this goes all the way back to its founders in the 30s, their expertise is false. These aren't race experts. These are critical race theorists. They're very different. They aren't experts on what's actually going on with race. They're experts about complaining about race in a particular way. It's a very different thing. And so when we start setting up policy and we start setting up our society, our institutions around that, we've got some problems. So right now, I want people to be able, I want people, especially academics, especially, journalists, people at, the high level functioning of society, to understand that this stuff can be understood. This is actually what it says. And then to start helping other people understand more and more of it. So that's really what New Discourses is about now, is producing those educational resources that people can draw upon to understand this movement that's threatening to rot our society.
Yeah, so there's this, reaction broadly, left or right, to political correctness, and seems like most people aren't too thrilled with it.
Yes, most people are not surprised that there's a reaction against it coming up from the right. The right has been targeting political correctness, at least since the 1990s, earlier probably, as a major issue, and they focus on it almost to the point now where it's not even clear they understand it properly, and they've gone into their own echo chamber on it. But it's more surprising to find out how deeply into the left the woke or the social justice, or however you want to call it, ideology is being rejected. The fact that you have to agree with them and that you have to speak or think in certain ways. I've talked to more and more and more people on the left who they have taken on some of these patterns of thought. They think, more sympathetically to it than I do, for example, but they don't accept it. The reaction to it now is growing very rapidly and across the spectrum. And as far as the left goes, we should differentiate. The right is a coalition of different points of view. The left is also a coalition of different points of view. And I think in the state of polarization that we're in right now, we've kind of forgotten that. Within each house, we are aware of it vaguely, or to different degrees. I think the right is more aware of its, factionalism with a kind of a broad coalition of factions. You've got the libertarian factions, and you've got the kind of conservative, social conservative factions that don't really get along with the libertarian faction that well when you really get to it. And you can name a handful of them. Well, on the left, you also have a pretty wide variety, and you do have the social justice left, and then you have kind of a liberal left, meaning philosophically liberal. You have a progressive left that is still, liberals who are progressive, so they exist. They want societal progress, and they see social justice and that movement as getting in the way of being able to do it, of doing the right things the wrong way, and therefore hampering the movement or even possibly setting it back, maybe decades. I was talking with some people far on the left just this weekend, and they were saying that they're really afraid that the social justice, they're progressive, deeply progressive, and they're afraid that they're going to knock us back 30 years in terms of race progress and sex and gender, sexuality progress, and so on. And of course, the outright Marxists don't like it either, which is humorous for a lot of people, because they see it as a elite bourgeois plot to steal the working class away, or to steal the left away from the working class, I should say. So it's a very narrow band on the left who's all in on this. And then there are a lot of people, kind of like that church analogy, you can kind of think of it like it's different levels of sophistication, who've taken on they think that way sometimes, and they care about it to some degree. And what's interesting is when they start to realize, and they are starting to realize, that there are other ways to approach the question of race or sex or gender or sexuality or whatever it is, they usually glom onto them pretty quickly. I had a very uncomfortable, I thought it was going to be uncomfortable, it turned out to be great, meeting last summer with a bunch of pretty rabid feminists. And I was thinking, oh man, they know who I am. They know about the papers. They know what we've done. I was like, this is going to be a uncomfortable meeting. And these feminists really liked me. Not as a person. Well, I don't know, maybe as a person. It's irrelevant, but my work. Because they said feminism should be based on science, and this isn't science. And they saw what I had done, Peter and Helen and I had done with the fake papers, and they were outraged, not at us, which you would expect, but at the people who have been making gender research a joke for, going on 30 years. And I think there's a lot of people on the left that are more slowly than is probably good for any of us, but who are starting to wake up to this. I talk to them frequently.
So it's, you're saying it's a narrow band, but it's a narrow band that has profound influence on our entire society.
Correct.
At the moment.
For two reasons.
Yeah.
One is that they're activists and they show up to everything. I can't tell you how many meetings, whether it's at the level of, task force for like state legislatures, mostly in the Pacific Northwest, school board meetings, different meetings of these these administrative boring meetings nobody goes to. Guess who goes to them? The activists. So I remember talking with Brett Weinstein, the faculty member at Evergreen State College, that it melted down kind of around him. And everybody thinks it melted down because of this story where they had the day of absence traditionally on campus, where traditionally all of the black people, students, faculty, so on, wouldn't come to campus one day to show how important they are, and, fine. And then 2016, I think, was the year they decided to reverse it. And they said, well, no, white people can come to campus. We're going to make it a white-free campus.
Yeah, and he objected.
Yeah. And everybody thinks that's why it melted down around him. But that was only one drop in the bucket. Most of the drops in the bucket were that he realized that something weird was going on with the administration of the school and started going to all of the faculty meetings. All of them. And there would be 7 people in there, 6 of whom were activists and 1 of whom was him. And so one of the reasons it's having such a profound influence is that the activists are showing up to the meetings. I've talked to a woman who works in a law society in Canada, and they were institutionalizing this there rather profoundly, and then she ran a campaign to get people to not go with this and to run for the board. And she ended up getting a narrow majority on the board of people who are more reasonable, who don't just go along with it. But activists show up and do the boring activist work. So that's one reason. The other is, I think, just generally that people, they hear the issues, they care about the issues. Racism's important, racism's bad, and it's dominated that conversation for so long now by shouting all the other voices off the table and saying how they're problematic or whatever, that there's very little alternative for people who care about those issues to turn to. So when I say that there's this kind of awakening on the left that's turning away from it, it's still very tenuous. You have to talk to them to some degree to get them to understand the differences between the two things. And generally, it comes down to a matter of worldview. Have you adopted a critical worldview? Do you have that critical consciousness? Or are you trying to look at things through either a more objective or a more fair or a more positive lens? That critical mindset is seductive because it's easy. It allows you to complain, and I don't know how much people want to hear about positive and negative rapport. Generally, you and I don't know each other very well, so when we talk, we'll stick around, we'll say positive things or whatever. I'm not going to tell you some horrible thing that happened, and not just because you're a journalist. I'm not going to, oh, this terrible thing happened in my family, this is how I feel. And that's called negative rapport. And typically we grow intimacy by talking about negative rapport, but we reserve negative rapport for intimate situations, our spouse, our closest friends and family. And the problem is once you open the negative rapport door, you start complaining and venting, usually to your friends. The whole relationship often becomes about that. So that critical mindset taps into that. It gets people to open up and just start complaining and whining and venting how their negativity. And there's something to having a norm where that's not really, like, I don't want to hear you complain. Are we really close? Do you have a moment? Let's sit down and talk. But if not, I don't want to hear you complain. I want to hear what you're doing, what's good, what's happening. And so it's this seduction to complain and whine that makes it so easy for people to get into and take on. So that problem has to be unwound still. So it has a great deal more power, even though people are starting to turn away from it, than I'm comfortable with anyway.
So, to finish up, it's interesting you talk about complaining. You've actually been doing, I think, a lot of things to try to, facilitate this discourse with the new discourses about one of this book that I came across a while ago. I think it's How to Have Impossible Conversations.
Right.
which you think you co-wrote with Peter.
Right.
Anyway, it's very interesting. You're actually putting yourself in a position where you're trying to help people.
Yes, I am very interested in not just writing stuff that complains about critical social justice. I don't want to create critical social justice studies and just complain about it. It does need to be, to use a word in that kind of universe, it does need to be exposed. To use a little bit more responsible word, it does need to be explained, and those are part of my core objective. But we also have to be able to offer people alternatives. We have to be able to, as you mentioned, how to have impossible conversations. We have to know how to sit down and talk with one another when we don't necessarily agree, or where there is some difference. And maybe the difference is just demographic and having to do with, do I understand racism or not? But let's enter that conversation with an assumption that it is possible to get me on the same page and to get you on the same page, and we can actually create that shared intention. I also think, because we're in this kind of narrative war period of history, everything's narratives. What did they say recently about the 1619 Project? It's that there are many views of history. And so that somehow justifies perpetrating a baloney one, a critical one, as a matter of fact. It's a critical theory, history revision, historical revisionism to besmirch the founding of the country. I'm not. If they want to forward the idea that this is, a variety of views, I want to forward positive ones. So I visited, for instance, in DC. Last week we met in DC, and I visited the National Archive, and I walked around, and I was like, wow, you can easily see what's going on here, and say the Rubenstein exhibit they've put in there. And it's like, wow, we were bad to immigrants in a lot of ways. Wow, we were bad to black people once, twice, three times, again and again in a lot of ways. Well, yeah, we'll make it better for you, and it's still really bad. So there are, women didn't get the vote until roughly 1920. It wasn't really women's equality in the workplace until maybe really 1980s, maybe early 1990s. So there's a lot of ways that you can go in there and you can say, that the United States is supposed to be about everybody having rights and freedoms and opportunities, and we really did a bad job of that. And wow, isn't our country built on a bunch of crap? That's one narrative. That's the critical narrative. There's another one, is like, wow, humans can be pretty gross, and we can make a lot of mistakes, and there are a lot of horrible institutions throughout history that somehow we've managed to start overcoming. And maybe we didn't overcome them as quickly as we could have, or maybe should have. Those are vague, weird words. How can we know how something should have been different? But nevertheless, we have overcome them. And the methods by which we overcame them are clear. And I think the American liberal experiment had a lot to do with that. Maybe not everything, and maybe there's still room to improve and perfect it, but we should acknowledge that the United States' history has been a history of progress. It has been a history of moving away from slavery, moving away from various injustices, moving away from unequal and divided societies into what we have now, which is really getting pretty cool. So if we're going to be in a narrative war, I think we need to start ignoring the people who want to tell the negative, pessimistic, cynical narrative, and we should acknowledge the truth of our past, and we should acknowledge that there were lessons we had to learn, and we should also celebrate that there is a genuine progressive narrative that, unfortunately, critical social justice literally calls a myth and an ideology that the powerful class invented to keep people down.
So I'm going to plug your book one more time, because I found it to be, very thoughtful and very helpful. How to have these impossible conversations, whether it's left, right, or just very different viewpoints. You're not sure. There's a lot of great ideas contained within it, and I'm sure also on the New Discourses website. Listen, thanks so much for taking the time. This has been very insightful.
Thank you.